Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about a brand new threat that I hadn't anticipated even a few months ago, that we would ever be facing any such dramatic change in the situation of professors and academic institutions as we are in recent months because of the changes in attitude in the United States. Well, I shouldn't attribute the whole United States to this thing because it's obviously a unique attitude of Donald Trump. But it certainly is having an impact, and especially most conspicuously at Harvard University. So I have two men here who work professionally in the field of protecting, or at least analyzing the nature of threats to academic freedom. And one of them is Robert Quinn, who is the executive director of something called Scholars at Risk Network, which I hadn't known about before, I'm sorry to say. So it's good to find out that there is such an organization, and that's in New York City. So Robert is going to have to leave a little early, so I'm going to give him the floor in a minute. But the second speaker, or the other speaker, I should say, is Professor Mark Spooner, who is a professor of education at the University of Regina here in Canada, where I'm located. And I don't think these gentlemen have met before, but they just reminisced about very recently having participated in a conference about academic freedom. I guess that was hosted or organized by the CAUT, the Canadian University Teachers Association. So Robert Quinn, tell me, let's set the world straight about what is this thing, what is this principle of academic freedom, what is this, is it an important human right? And if so, why is it practically important to society so that we should worry if anything goes wrong or anything impedes academic freedom?
Terrific. Thanks, Meta, and thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to have a chat with you. I think in its most simple terms, academic freedom is the term we use that includes both a human rights dimension. It's a right to ask questions, to develop ideas, to share ideas, and also a core value of higher education. So it has both dimensions. But fundamentally, academic freedom is about protecting the processes of truth seeking, right? So to whatever the process is in a particular discipline, but it's that process, that professional skill exercised possibly by a professor, possibly by a student, possibly by others. But if they're applying that professional rigor to developing and sharing ideas, academic freedom is the term we use for protecting that. And why does that matter to society? Well, because that's a fundamental pillar of a free, open, stable, democratic society. And so the sort of big message is that we tend to think about a free press as essential, even in countries where they know they don't believe what's in the press. And we talk about independent judiciary as essential, even if people never come in contact with the legal system themselves. We also need to think about academic freedom as absolutely essential to democracy.
One of the first things that occurred to me was, what are the boundaries of it? We talk, I think of it entirely as, I'm a retired professor myself at the University of Toronto, and I never had the slightest challenge to my autonomy, to my right to say or teach or run my classes however I wanted. I never encountered anything of the kind. I never had to think about it, except actually, I'm 93 years old, and I arrived in Berkeley in the fall of 1949, the same week as the loyalty oath began to occur. So my first experience in the university was with a challenge to academic freedom, but my goodness, it was a big deal for the whole year. And in fact, people gave up their whole careers and moved away and were fired, and all kinds of terrible things happened because if they didn't want to sign an oath promising to be loyal to the United States. And the notion was that these were communists who were infiltrating the universities. But that was nothing compared to the kinds of challenges that we're seeing now. That little loyalty oath was a piddling concession that one might have to make in comparison to the challenges that some of the universities are now facing. So I haven't thought about this. What are the boundaries? Do people outside of universities are people entitled to academic freedom if they're teaching? For example, I think now Trump is talking about taking money away from Harvard and giving it to trade schools. Well, would trade school teachers be entitled to anything like academic freedom? What are the boundaries of academic freedom?
Well, so it's a great question, and there's a couple other important questions woven into there. So like you said, in your life experience, you did encounter pressures because of that issue of the loyalty oaths in the 1940s and 1950s in the United States, right? And I wouldn't call that piddling, because each attempt to erode the freedom is significant. And in particular, the ones that seem like a small concession add up to very big erosions of the right. So, and yes, any academic might go their whole career without experiencing a pressure, but it doesn't mean that they have full freedom, right? So one of the things we think is really important for people to know is it's a myth that there are safe disciplines and that other disciplines are the troublemaking ones that have problems, right? And that's one of the things we're witnessing now, and governments try to encourage that thinking. So right now, the U.S. government is trying to make faculty at Columbia University think that the troublemakers in the humanities and social sciences are the reason that the physical sciences are losing their research grants. It's not true. They're losing their research grants because the government is taking away their research grants as a raw exercise of power, but they're doing this smokescreen on the top, right? So number one is, yeah, you might not feel it, but it doesn't mean it's not happening around you. Number two, the question about the boundaries, it's a really important one. It's a good question. You know, what's protected by the scope of academic freedom? But what we like to say is that's only the good question. The better question is who decides what's protected. And for us at Scholars at Risk, the most important question is what happens to people when it's determined that they have somehow bumped up against the boundary, wherever the boundary is, right? And so our work is about saying never should scholars suffer physical consequences, physical harm, imprisonment, prosecution for asking questions or for doing their research and so forth. So that consequences issue. And that's really what we're seeing in the United States right now. We're seeing absolutely off the scale consequences for small things that did happen, and there are needs for some reforms, but the government's behavior is all out of whack there. So the unsatisfying answer to where's the boundary is it depends. And it goes to the who decides. And the answer that we would submit is the boundary of academic freedom is the boundary of inquiry. It's the boundary of thought. And so scholars in the same discipline, using the same standards, using the same ethical and social responsibility principles, have to decide how far you go, right? So it isn't that there's no limit. There are limits, but there are limits that are determined by the field in a responsible and professional way as determined by the field. And why is that the answer? Because that's what we know leads to maximum freedom. That's what leads to maximum knowledge production. That's what leads to maximum benefit for society.
Okay, that's wonderful. Now you're professionally engaged in defending people when their right to academic freedom is eroded or impaired or compromised in some way. What kinds of things have you done, or could you do, or would you even recommend that others do, even in this situation? Or tell me about your own work history.
Well, so, Scholars at Risk, it's in the name, right? So our core mission is to protect threatened scholars. We were founded at the University of Chicago. Now we're at New York University, but we're an international network. So there's over 650 institutions in the network, 40 countries, increasing the organized international chapter. So there's a SAR Canada chapter with many of the Canadian universities that belong, and we're thrilled to have their participation in it. And the idea behind the network is universities have always taken people in. But they've done it ad hoc. They haven't necessarily done it together, and there's strength in solidarity. There's more efficiency in trying to help people together. And so our first 25 years, we sort of developed the skill set, the toolbox for how to help the most threatened scholars who aren't safe in their home country get to a place where they can keep working, right? So that's most of what we do. And for the moment, although that moment is getting closer, I guess, we haven't done a lot of relocating scholars, say, from North America somewhere else. For the moment, North America has been a receiving country, helping scholars from other places, but it can happen, right? So we were modeled on the World War II era, where Germany scholars had to flee, right? Now, I'm happy to say at this point, there's a big Scholars at Risk chapter in Germany, and they host many, many scholars, right? So Germany is now a receiving country, a host country. So um, unimaginable, yes, I think in a rational world to think that the US would have scholars fleeing to go to other countries. But unfortunately, we are very close to that at this moment. And so Scholars at Risk may be involved in helping professors who've lost their jobs or their visas in the US find positions elsewhere in the network, possibly in Canada, possibly in Europe. We also, though, can do an awful lot. That's a high touch, involved effort, right? One at a time. The bigger impact is going to come from everybody speaking up. So letting people see the consequences, letting people know the harms that are happening from these attacks, blowing the whistle if you have lived in or worked with people who have lived under authoritarianism and know where this is all leading, making sure we get that message out to people so that people don't fall for the smokescreen. They don't fall for the fact that the state is saying, oh, we're here to protect somebody vulnerable on your campus, when the truth is that is not at all their intention. Their intention is to destroy the autonomy and the freedom on the campus so that it can't critique what the government is doing.
Well, Canada will probably invite lots of scholars who feel they need to leave. And I saw a video last night about England. Apparently, UK is second in terms of the expenditures on scientific research, and they are probably going to up that so as to make opportunities for Americans to come if they need to. Mm-hmm. But then I saw an interview with a Harvard professor who said, we hope that doesn't come, that they really don't want Harvard faculty to have to leave the country, and they'll do everything they can to prevent us getting to that point. But it's already got to that point in some cases, because I know there are three professors from Yale who've arrived here in Toronto and mm-hmm. are going to be teaching here. So how likely do you think that is, given you mentioned visas? Because I'm throwing a lot of questions at you at once. I'm sorry, you have to sort them out. But I wonder about the students, foreign graduate students, perhaps, or even any international students coming in who are now not going to be able to get visas. Is that something that you can fight? It looks to me like the government has you by the throat on that, because the government can decide not to give visas any damn place and time they wish, right?
So several things in there, right? So number one is, I would say, we're not there yet. So by my invoking the history, I'm not claiming we are in the equivalent of the 1930s yet. And I would say for everyone in U.S. higher education or concerned about U.S. higher education, which frankly I think should be everybody in global education, now is the time to organize. Now is the time to mobilize. Now is the time to really speak to constituencies that have the ability to make a difference. And that mostly means the public. It mostly means the local constituencies who really benefit from the higher education infrastructure and may not really know it, because maybe the higher ed sector hasn't done the greatest job in conveying the various ways it's intertwined with really local communities. So there are caricatures out there about what U.S. higher education is, and the administration makes it talk about as if it's only really the top 20 institutions in the country, whereas the vast majority of higher education is community colleges and local liberal arts colleges and religious institutions and institutions that are deeply, deeply woven into their states, into their cities, into their counties, and just really, really important. So the most important thing to do right now is not to look for your passport and pack a bag. We're not there. It's really to defend the institutions that we have and that really, matter, to our communities. Now, the biggest risks, I think those individuals that are most at risk are the two categories that we've touched on. One, which is people whose visas might be canceled or threatened, right? So they're not citizens in the United States, but they may have a long-term permit or so forth. And you're right, the government does have an enormous amount of power over those procedures, and it can do an inordinate amount of damage and harm to individuals and to institutions and to communities, and frankly to the American people, by choosing what I would call extra legal measures in how they use that power, right? So, and what do I mean by extra legal? I mean there are clear legal powers as they're articulated in statutes, and the government could choose to follow those, but for the most part it has chosen not to, because those usually require notice periods and evidence, and they're very precise on how that power is supposed to be used. And then there's blatantly illegal action, and I don't use that word because frankly that's up to the courts to decide. But what we're seeing is a lot of actions by the administration to not follow the letter of the law, but instead to use a raw exertion of power, usually over something that's not directly related to the claim of the government. So a blanket canceling of all student visas is obviously a grossly excessive use of force if you're claiming that a handful of students did something that was contrary to their visa, right? So you're right, the government has a lot of power there, and they will do a lot of damage in exercising it the way they are, but it's not unlimited power, right? So the courts have been slowly catching up. They have been saying you have to afford due process. You have to do this in the legal channels. And so number one is to remember that. And yes, we're going to see a lot more lawsuits happening, no question. The challenge is while all that's going on, it's going to take time. And people have to make decisions about their lives, right? You can't put your life on hold for 3 years while a court case plays out. So some students will transfer to other institutions or other countries. And some students and families who are thinking of sending their child to an institution in North America may say, hey, Canada seems like a much more rational place these days. And they have great universities too. So maybe we should go there, So those harms will happen. But it isn't time to give up on U.S. higher ed. It's the time to push back.
As I'm reading it in the newspaper, it looks as if the courts, by and large, are slapping him on the wrist, at least, that, insofar as they can make any difference, they're turning down all of the things that he's trying to do and refusing to allow it. But the question is, can he go ahead and do it anyway? Because the problem with the courts, I mean, let's assume that they all continue this. It's not an assumption; it's a hope that they do continue rejecting some of the things that he's saying and doing, but they don't have any control over it, do they? They can't go march into the immigration department or wherever and say, now we're going to issue visas to these people, even if you don't. What enforcement mechanisms are there for the courts to make a difference in protecting academic freedom?
Well, I suppose ironically, your question goes back to our first question, of why does academic freedom matter, right? And I would say, I said it's essential to a democratic society, and you're helping me to make that point, because ultimately the only enforcement mechanism in a democracy is a well-informed electorate exercising its insistence that rule of law is observed, right? So at the end of the day, the court is not the final enforcer, and we all know that, right? The court is the referee. The court blows the whistle, but they can't actually enforce physically a lot of the rules, right? They can call for the violations. At the end of the day, it's going to be up to the crowd watching. It's going to be up to the elected officials who represent the electorate to demand accountability. And that has been lacking so far.
Indeed.
The courts so far have been doing their jobs. They are appropriately and temperamentally generally designed to be deferential to the government, because the government is generally presumed to be trying to follow the law. I think the courts are going to have to adapt that assumption. I think they're going to have to decrease that deference, and they're going to have to make the government prove that it is trying to follow the law. But so far, they do seem to be doing what they can, and it's going to be up to the administration first to decide whether it will follow judicial orders, and if it doesn't, it's going to be up to elected officials and the electorate to respond to that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the real test will be when some of these cases are escalated to the Supreme Court. And I would wonder, if you were a betting man, would you bet that the Supreme Court is going to defer to Trump on most of these issues, or not?
Well, we don't have to speculate, because several of the cases have already gotten in a procedural way before the court. And for the most part, the court is trying to navigate the difference between extra legal activity, where the court has insisted, for example, on a reasonable measure of due process in the deportation cases, versus extreme exercises of policy difference, right? So let me spell out what I mean by that, right? So the manner in which the administration has tried to slash research funding in the United States, the manner in which it has done it, I think, is extra legal. It has been outside of the normal appropriations processes, outside of the legislative process, outside of the terms of contracts and grants, and all under a fig leaf of protecting violations of rights that may or may not have been proven to have happened, right? So the court should appropriately say that is outside the bounds, because it's not following the normal. But if the administration, as it has just done, proposes a budget that slashes research funding by 50, 60%, as an advocate for higher education and the long-term well-being of the American people, I think that's a terrible policy, but it's not inappropriate. It's a political choice, right? So I think the courts are going to have to wrestle with walking that line and insisting on rule of law and insisting on process, which will necessarily slow down the administration. But they also are going to be trying to make sure that even if they think terrible policy choices are being made, they're not declaring a policy choice illegal.
Yeah. Well, my impression, unfortunately, is that the public is not going to do what you are counting on them or us to do. I have a friend, Arlie Hochschild, who studied the Appalachian region, the former coal miners, and was trying to understand this authoritarian populism that Trump represents. And she's been back in touch with the people that she got to know in this little town. And she says that if they are turning at least bit against Trump, because they voted for Trump overwhelmingly, but if they're turning it all against Trump, it's for things like jeopardizing Medicaid or some financial concerns and not at all for human rights or civil liberties concerns. So there doesn't seem to be any backlash or whatever against so far in his popularity because of these what offends you and me.
No. Well, I would, and forgive me, and my apologies to you and to Mark, because I do have to step off soon. But number one is I would say, this isn't about any one politician. Nothing that's going on in the United States is new. We have seen this in our work over 25 years all around the world.
Really?
And it's the history that inspired the creation of our project, right? So this is power trying to assert itself against the free people. And I think it's really important that we know that this is not about one individual, right? It's a choice. Democracy is a choice, and it requires lots of people standing up for that choice over and over and over again. So I fully agree with you that the average electorate isn't necessarily thinking that an attack on Harvard University is an attack on them.
Mm-hmm.
But when they start to see their community colleges close, when they start to see regional hospitals close, when they start to see that there aren't as many new medical treatments coming online over the years, when they start to see that the government support for agriculture or for public health or for clean water just isn't there anymore, they're going to start to see the consequences and how they affect their lives, right? So for those of us who work in sort of a longer term job, and clearly higher ed is a longer term job, part of our job is to help make longer term impacts more visible in the near term. Because not because we're in any way special or know more what's right, but because if we can make the impacts more visible in the near term, hopefully we can decrease the suffering that will result from some of these really short-sighted decisions.
Well, God bless you. That's a perfect description of, I guess, the most appropriate approach. Well, I'm really glad to know you exist. I'm sorry I haven't before. So we will be following up and keeping track of what all is going on and what all you're doing, and may call on you again because this is such an important issue. So
terrific. Well, I appreciate you calling attention to it. And Mark, I appreciate you writing on it. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Bless you. All right, carry on.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, so let's turn to Mark Spooner. Hello, Mark.
Well, hello. Let me start by saying thanks for having me on your show and for sharing the space with Robert Quinn.
Let me ask you, you were at this conference where he spoke remotely and you spoke in the flesh. And I'm curious to know what you said. Tell us an overview of your paper, and then we'll go back to wherever you want to go.
Sure, I think that will serve as an important recap of where we've gone so far in the conversation as well. I was on a panel about the relationship between academic freedom and democracy. Mm-hmm. And so, as Robert indicated, when we ask people about what institutions, what pillars support a democracy, they'll probably always invariably mention, and these are always in their aspirational ideal, the free press. So reporting on the daily happenings of government and other things that are happening in society. There's the judiciary, where you want everyone being treated equally before the law. And they'll typically mention the legislature, free and fair elections. What often gets overlooked is the academy and the academy's role in supporting, in two ways. One, in being its own pillar in its own right, but also the academy supports the other three pillars. So, for instance, we instruct and train and help lawyers that will become judges. We train journalists who become, who report on the press, and we often also provide the best available evidence upon which to base public policy and to judge public policy so that even opposition parties and the public can know, is the public policy that the government's rolling out, is that in resonance with the best available evidence? And if it's not, why? And we can ask difficult questions of government. So, everything we're seeing right now is part of the attacks. All of these attacks are part of the larger authoritarian playbook, and that's to undermine public trust in institutions that question power. And so the Trump government currently is doing that in terms of questioning the judiciary, calling them activist judges and woke judges. They're definitely doing it against the academy, who often serve as historical memory. We have people who've devoted their lives to studying different aspects of history and public policy, and can really explain the context and history of how different public policy became to be, and why it's not effective or effective, and how we can make it better. And we can ask different, difficult questions of government, and we train students to ask those same difficult questions. And so we're a thorn in the side of anyone who wants unjust, unearned power, because we're going to question them about it. And so that's one of the key pieces why academic freedom is important. And just to review that, and then I know you want to jump in probably, but to review one piece, academic freedom really is about being able to do our jobs. And what is our job? Typically, a professor at a university has as their mandate research, teaching, and service. And service is both intra and extra. So service to the university so that we can speak out and critique our own institutions and critique policy at our own institutions as part of a collective governance, following the way it works. But then also our ability to speak out and make public what we're doing, and to talk to the public, because like judges, we're really in the service of the public. We're not in the service of the university that hires us, but rather the larger public that helps fund us. And that's the same with a judge. They're there to serve the public and not the people who appointed them, although that doesn't always happen.
That service angle is probably downplayed more than the other two, in my experience.
True.
It's certainly not.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder how much the connection is with democracy empirically. I started thinking just this morning, how did fascist and totalitarian states, how far did they go in controlling university inquiries? I think I really don't know the answer to that. I kind of think that what is going on in the US now, this very open grab for power to make sure that the only things that are taught in the classroom are, and the only students in the classroom are people that the government approves of because they agree with the government. And I'm not even sure that other really abusive states have gone that far. And it's really a question for a historian, because I'm thinking back to Nazi times and how much academic freedom was there. I mean, I hear of cases in which many professors, of course, caved in and became pro-Nazi or spoke in that direction. But could they get away with any kind of critique of the government in those days? And I don't know the answer, and I don't know whether you do.
Well, I'd say no, they couldn't, and they either had to be pro or silent, and I think that's what led to the great influx of professors and scholars in the United States, because it was a bastion of freedom at that time, where it counter to Nazi Germany. But you can see it in other examples too. In Hungary, you can see it in Poland, Turkey is another great example, but Hungary is one where the Central European University had to move out even and move to Vienna. So
Yes and no, because it's more ambiguous. I was listening to Ezra Klein a couple of weeks ago, talking to two people about this, and one of them was a guy who'd written a book about the what's going on in Hungary now, and in particular, they had a good discussion about this. The thing about the Central European University, which the Soros had founded. He said, well, you can, it's much more subtle. It's not, he didn't say whether anybody had actually been jailed or, but, how much they'd lost their jobs or what they did. But he said, he went there, he looked out in front, there's a big plaque saying, this is Central European University, and it's funded by George Soros. And he goes in, and there are faculty people, and you can walk down the hall, and you can go to classes, and there are people. Everything's going on there, but it's people are careful. People can't. Apparently, it's not really visible, but there is. There certainly are restrictions and constraints. So I think what's bothering me is the notion that what's going on with respect to Harvard is so blatant, so flagrant, so in your face. You can't imagine anybody doing anything that overtly abusive. I'm thinking also back. I used to be a friend of Alex Enkelis, and I remember he taught. He went to China just a year before the Tiananmen Square. And he taught in a university there as a visiting faculty member. And when he came back, he said, when Tiananmen Square occurred, he said, I wasn't a bit surprised when Tiananmen Square took place, because the students were all telling me overtly everywhere that they wanted democracy, they wanted freedom of speech, they wanted all of these things. So he said it was very, very overt that that's what they were demanding. And so when there was this protest, asking for it in the square, it did not surprise him. It also, of course, didn't surprise him what the government did. But what did happen, I wonder, in the universities afterwards, how much after that did people feel more limited in what they could say in the Chinese universities, and how is it now? For example, to pursue my own wandering imagination, we're saying that we have to have good scientific education in universities to do good science. But my God, the Chinese are doing wonderful science now. They're ahead of us, maybe in AI. No, not really, but pretty close. With this DeepSeek thing and so on.
do you think they learn about Tiananmen Square?
No, they don't.
Do they talk about that history?
Physics. They apparently learn
Sure.
physics very well.
I think that lots of dictatorships and fascist states have excelled at different parts of humanity. But when we talk about freedom and the freedom to question, the freedom to present multiple histories, contested histories, the histories of the subaltern, these are things where the playbook is pretty similar. And I think when you mention Harvard, Harvard is definitely such a blatant attack, and it's such a symbol. It's the oldest, most prominent university in the United States. But these attacks have been happening over the last few years at the state level. So there's been attacks on critical race theory, entire areas of study. So critical race theory, gender studies, colonial studies, anything that deals with diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these things have already happened, and there isn't really that I can think of a Republican state that hasn't banned or curtailed certain parts of these areas of study. Yes. So PEN America has been following it quite well and following these what they call gag orders. And so Florida, Texas, of course, are leading the way, but these are happening across the United States at the state level, and there's also the banning of teaching divisive concepts. So when we talk about the history of the United States and the slave trade, the slave labor that built many parts of the United States, that those kinds of questions aren't allowed in the classroom when we talk about colonialism and settler colonialism in the United States and the land theft from the indigenous people. None of those concepts can go without being challenged because they make someone feel uncomfortable. Well, a good education should always make you feel uncomfortable. I think that transformation is difficult. You're literally transforming. You're becoming a new person, and that kind of transformation isn't like putting on a pair of jeans. You're changing. It's not that straight up transactional. And I think that that's another piece where we've limited the public imagination about what a higher education can be. That it's only about this transactional. It's training for the workforce in service of the labor market and industry. But it's much more than that. And of course, it does serve that. You often do get a better job in a job because you've gone to post-secondary education. But we shouldn't limit our vocabulary and our imagination and our narratives about what it is a public education can be. And some of the things it can be is it can provide contested histories, can question government, can understand how power operates at the municipal, provincial, in our case, and federal levels. But some other issues that I think we should touch on before time runs out is that academic freedom, it doesn't operate in the same way across countries. So in Canada, Canada is very unique that academic freedom operates as a function of our collective agreements. So because we're mostly unionized in Canada, the protections we have don't come from legislation. They actually come from our collective agreements, which say this is a necessary tool to do our work.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's enforceable at the labor standards as part of a collective labor and our collective agreements. It's part of that kind of a contract. Whereas in the United States, there are parts of it that are under the legislature, and there it often gets conflated with freedom of expression or free speech, and so the two are very different.
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah. So a free speech doesn't necessitate any expertise at all. I could say anything really until it puts people in danger, maybe. But I could yell fire almost at any point, or I could spout nonsense about any kind of chemtrails or that the Earth is flat or that kind of thing, and I won't be put in jail for it. I'm allowed to say those things, but that's freedom of expression. But academic freedom is a tool for me to be able to do my work, a specific tool that I've negotiated in my collective agreement, in this case in Canada, and that is the freedom to do research, teaching, and service. And that's an important distinction, I think, that many people don't really realize.
Actually, I wasn't aware of that. I hadn't thought about it anyway. So
Yeah.
good point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I thought if people are interested, there's two really good books that have recently come out. One is by Jason Stanley, who's one of the Yale professors that you alluded to earlier, moving to the University of Toronto Monk School. Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Very instructive. Mm-hmm. And another, if you're more focused on higher ed, is by Eve Darian Smith, Policing Higher Education, the Anti-Democratic Attack on Scholars and Why It Matters. Two really good and recent books.
Hold it up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Eve, okay.
Eve Darian Smith and
Policing.
This one here.
That one I've seen. Yeah, Jason Stanley's everywhere now on TV.
Yeah, he's definitely.
Yeah.
And I think there's another point. Let's talk about that. It's not just the American professors coming up to Canada, but it's all of the scholars around the world who don't feel comfortable going to the United States any longer that may come to Canada. So it's not just Americans coming up, but people from across the world who don't feel safe any longer going there could choose Canada. And of course, one way to keep ideas that you don't like out is to keep the people who have those ideas out. So when you bring in multiple cultures and you necessarily get different versions of history and contested versions of history, and all of them should inform and help layer our great understanding in a tapestry fashion of history and where and how that plays out, not just one official history, which is often I see what Republican states, I think we can name them, Republican states want to create.
Well, I know that Florida was doing things about grade schools and libraries, and maybe several other states are saying certain books that you can't have in your library or certainly can't be taught in the classroom.
Which Alberta is currently doing, right? I don't know if you're following. Alberta is often a bellwether province here, and
I was just about to ask you whether any infringements are taking place in Canada, because I'm not aware.
So Alberta is doing a review right now about which books should be banned from schools. They're doing a review.
What criteria do they have in mind? I mean, I think I've heard that To Kill a Mockingbird is in the U.S. or some states would be forbidden, but I can't remember what others, but ones that sort of touch upon racism.
Racism, gender is another big one. Alberta seems to be fearful, at least the UCP government, the United Conservative Party, is fearful of anything touching on diversity. And it's their party policy to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices on university campuses. And we've seen that University of Alberta, although it's not government policy, but a UCP policy, the University of Alberta has already acquiesced to that. And I think that brings us back to a point you mentioned earlier as well, and that is that these gag orders, often the most fearful part of them is self-censorship.
Mm-hmm.
When people self-censor and don't speak out, it's, to get to Hannah Arendt, it's the quiet neighbors who didn't speak out when faced with atrocity that was the greatest horror, and I think that's a piece that we often leave out, that people self-censor, and then important. The government isn't questioned on and held to account in a way that they ought to, because people are remaining quiet and seemingly neutral in the face of great injustice.
Do you have the impression that what's going on in Alberta along these lines is being copycat from things that go on in the U.S., or is this a kind of an international mindset? I'm trying to find a word for what might be a kind of a global philosophy that is, I find quite puzzling, and it could be that it's locally generated in many different countries, springing up here and there, or it could be primarily a copycat phenomenon where especially a would-be dictator in one country tries to promote things based on what looks like what has succeeded in the U.S. or elsewhere. Is anybody studying that in terms of is this a contagion, or is there some root thing that's springing up everywhere?
Well, recently there's been a lot of studies documenting the democratic backsliding, the global democratic backsliding, where previously thought to be democratic or on the road to democracy, a liberal democracy, have now backslid, and that's happening throughout the world, and including the United States. And we saw it in some aspects here in Canada when, under the Harper government, scientists couldn't speak out when they attempted to cancel the census. That's important data that was being withheld, and that will forever. 2011 census that data won't be there because we feared facts. And I think that anytime a government fears facts, it erodes democracy and limits voice. I think there's other subtle ways that governments in Canada are redirecting what universities do and their mission, and that's by instituting performance-based funding, so that they start measuring, earnings after graduation, employment after graduation, graduation in the related field. Things like that help redirect the mandate of universities by making them much more, forcing them really by using funding as a lever to be much more in the service again of the industry and the labor market. And I think that's
Hold on,
again
let me-
limiting.
I'm not sure I've even heard of this.
Yeah, so in Ontario and Alberta, there's now performance-based funding. It hasn't been pushed to what they first announced would be the higher limits, but I think in both provinces, up to 60% of the total funding was on the line when they first proposed it. I think it's a little bit less than that.
You got to tell me the whole principle. Is it that if, let's say, sociology students don't make as much when they graduate as optometry students, then
Yes.
they fund optometry more than sociology?
Or fund the university more, encouraging them to take take fields that pay more. So the professional fields would definitely be a winner, and the liberal arts would be a loser. Even though we know that in the long run, those fields end up making equal or more money after 10 years. So the other part about it is, you're encouraging people who are not minoritized, because we also know that minoritized graduates make less than their counterparts who are not minoritized. So these are subtle ways of encouraging racism. And so they're very dangerous mechanism by which to control what happens at a university, even though at first, who could be against performance? They seemingly, that would be a good thing.
Okay, now wait a minute. You think that this performance thing has an impact on racial composition of
Well, I think schools that are less minoritized in terms of their student body get rewarded because those students make more money. Like that, we know that minoritized students or job applicants, new employees, make less money. So that's some of the insidious, perverted effects of these kinds of mechanisms in their attempt to control what happens on university campuses.
Okay, that I hadn't heard. Before we quit, because we're
Yeah.
at the end now, I want to ask about anti-Semitism, because I'm just astounded to hear them saying that Harvard is full of anti-Semitism, or any university is full of Semitism. I taught 40 some years at the universities, several different universities. I don't think I ever saw one single instance of anti-Semitism. And so when people say that it's going on now, well, what could have happened? I don't know. I did see some other kinds of, discriminatory stuff. I remember there was a certain year when there was this thing called anti-Paki. All the Pakistani students were finding that they were really experiencing discrimination, and I would see it in the term papers the students would write. They would talk about Pakistani.
Yeah, that's incorrect.
That's the only kind of racist or a kind of discrimination that I remember ever encountering, but certainly nothing like anti-Semitism. What is that all about?
Well, let's start by saying any form of discrimination ought to be denounced and vehemently opposed. That's an agreement. I think we should be in agreement there. I think that what is happening is that, especially the American government, is using anti-Semitism, the guise of or cloak of anti-Semitism, in a way to suppress anything that they deem woke, which would be diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I think they're also we need to examine what counts as anti-Semitism. One ought to be able to critique the Israeli government. The actions of a government can be critiqued without that being anti-Semitic. And I think that this is what's purposely happening. Some people are purposely conflating that one ought to be able to critique the Israeli government without critiquing or being anti-Semitic. And definitely in terms of the Trump administration, they're using that cloak to withhold funding and suppress entire areas of study and of teaching and
Well,
research.
There's also the thing about these encampments on campus a couple of years ago, maybe just last year, I don't know. But, there were lots and lots of students who put up tents and tried to protest, and they were doing this on behalf of the abuses that were going on in Gaza and saying that they were pro-Palestinian. Well, okay, I guess maybe I'm anti-Semitic because I think I'm more pro-Palestinian now for sure than I am when I look at what Netanyahu's government is doing. So,
Sure, I think that's the case for many. And I think that many of those protests were met with heavy-handed police presence and state authority presence.
well, when they criticize universities for not knocking down these tents and refusing to let students put them up, are they? And when they say that there's Jewish students on campus who have felt unsafe, what really went on? Were these Jewish students standing up for Israel and getting people yelling at them for doing it, or what? Or were they really discriminated against for being Jewish? Now that, if anti-Semitism is the term is used correctly, I think it only should properly be applied to people who are mistreated or looked down upon or looked upon unfavorably for their ethnic or religious identity,
Sure.
and not for their politics. But I'm not sure whether that is. What are the criteria that are being applied in this case when they talk about anti-Semitism?
Well, I think there have been detailed studies that people could look up in the Canadian context. There was a case at the University of Toronto, your university, where someone was denied employment because of their critiques of Israel in terms of the state and not in terms of anti-Semitism. There's the CAUT, I think, has also examined anti-Semitism and across campuses in Canada. Though I will say again that any true anti-Semitism ought to be denounced. Any form of discrimination on our campuses and in our societies ought to be denounced and vehemently opposed. But we do great harm when we label any critique of government as that. And I think that that's purposely happening, especially in the context of the United States and the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, okay. But I'm not aware of very much of that in Canada. Are you saying that we really have a problem, or just better watch out because you have to be on guard?
Well, I think that the price of democracy is vigilance always, and I think that yes, we have to be on guard. And but I think there have been developments in Canada that have curtailed areas of study, and I think that Alberta is a ground zero. I think it's an important place to examine and to try to understand what's happening. But I think Ontario is another one. Another piece is just the great underfunding in general that is across Canada, the great underfunding of post-secondary institutions where students are forced to, I always say, graduate often the students are forced to graduate with a mortgage on their house of knowledge.
Mhm.
Now, when you graduate with a mortgage on your house of knowledge, the immediacy and urgency of getting employment and seeing a return on investment that's direct and monetary become quite enhanced. That's very important. Whereas I think if it were more affordable, more people would consider attending and studying the full spectrum that is the human condition, and that help us understand each other and communicate and act in a peaceful manner with each other, and to create, if not understanding, at least tolerance of each other and of difference. And I think that's an important piece that we're losing when universities have to charge so much for tuition and have to seek funding elsewhere in corporations and benefactors who then put their own conditions on what's permissible or not on a university campus.
Is it CAUT that is the main or only organization that is working to address these issues in Canada? Are there other outfits that, for example, if viewers watching this want to give their support to a campaign to defend academic freedom, where, and let's say they're not on the faculty of university, wouldn't be connected with CAUT, where would they be able to contribute some of their energies or money?
I think the best way to contribute would be, one, yes, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, to follow their campaigns, but also to write letters to the editor, to reply when people present a very skewed version of what a university campus is and what's happening at university. I think that the general public needs to be aware of the importance of that work. And one piece that we didn't touch upon at all, even, it really is that every piece of technology, every innovation that you use today has somehow touched a university campus, whether it's your iPhone, whether it's vaccines, whether it's FM radio, Google algorithms, all of those things, Gatorade, the Heimlich maneuver, even Viagra has touched a university campus. So that we don't see it though, but that research is that important and leads to all the modern conveniences that we enjoy today. So I think I'd like to end on that, in that that to keep being defiantly hopeful. That hope in itself is a radical act and to speak out, to not be afraid to speak out, because if we don't speak out, we're going to lose our ability to do so. And what's happening in the United States isn't isolated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Very stimulating and beneficial. Thank you, and carry on.
All right. Thank you. Thanks again.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.